Hi everyone, we are going to be speaking about the first Islamic conquests. That is that moment after the Prophet Muhammad died, after the Ridda Wars, when the Arab Muslim soldiers moved out of Arabia and into the larger parts of the Middle East. Now, this is not just a topic of general historical concern, it is also a, let's say, trope, a commonplace that people go back to speak about images of destruction and the so-called insanity and violence of Muslims. And in fact, it's something that continues to be brought up again and again, often compared in a sense to the idea of the barbarians invading Rome and destroying things. And in fact, even in historical scholarship, traditionally, not anymore, but traditionally, especially in popular literature, the idea that the rise of Islam, the expansion of nomadic Muslim groups out of Arabia into the rest of the world, marks somehow the break or death of the Roman Empire and the start of a different civilization. Now we're going to be looking into whether or not that's true or not, and basically it's not. But I do want to point out that often these images, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire, note the date, 19th century, when people are become obsessed with some of these topics. Another type of common depiction of what conquest is imagined as: raving hordes coming in, raping women, stealing material, burning down cities. Is that actually the case? What is the myth? What is the reality of the conquests, and how and why did they take place? Now we're going to be delving into that piece by piece. Let's look at the first war of expansion. Again, we are looking at the dashed line here. We're starting off from Medina and Mecca, that is to say the centers of the nascent Muslim/believer community. As we pointed out, after the Ridda Wars, these tribes, which had been fighting one another, which had now been convened and re-centralized under the command of Abu Bakr, had to, in a sense, redirect their energies towards other fights in other spaces of raiding. And one of those spaces was the areas north of Arabia, that is both Palestine, Syria, here under the control of the Byzantines, along that with Egypt, one of the more populous and rich provinces of the area, as well as up into what is today Iraq and northern Arabia, areas that were under the control of the Byzantine lands. They were under the control of the Sasanians, the Persian Empire, with their capital here in Ctesiphon, right there. So what's going to happen is that very quickly after 632, possibly even earlier, possibly under the command of the Prophet Muhammad, according to some Syriac sources, but we do have notions that these expansions occurred very soon after the Ridda Wars. Now, what is their priorities? Why are they expanding? One, I think, is a way to deal with the question of how to redirect the energies of these nomadic groups. The other thing is that we have a believer movement, a very strong pietistic, transformative new religion that believes the end of the world is coming, and it's going to happen in Jerusalem. So they want to focus on Syria and Palestine, and that is the area in which they move into. Abu Bakr, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the believers, moves in, organizes 4 armies. There's probably about 24,000 troops. First priority is to control the countryside, to attack and subdue the other nomadic tribes in Syria and Palestine so that they can then move into this area and control it well. The second priority is to northern Arabia and Iraq, where the Sasanians are, and again, the focus is on the nomads. So when we look at what they're actually moving to, they're moving into areas that are very different from where they were living before. Mecca and Medina, very deserty, oasis towns with some farming, but very little, mostly nomadic lifestyles, except in some, again, oasis towns. Whereas they move into these much greener, larger centers of cultivation, initially Syria, and then Iraq, and then, of course, Egypt, these become major in different places to live. And in fact, they're not familiar with the population. The leaders of the new Muslim troops want to keep separate communities because they believe, again, that they're one, they don't want their troops just mixing about with these people, but they also, and just like we have military bases today to sequester troops from the general population, but they also believed, again, that they were part of a new believer movement and that these people and the locals were not necessarily part of it. And in fact, conversion of the initial of the local population was not a priority in any ways. This is more about reaching Jerusalem and controlling these areas militarily. In fact, it was often discouraged by the local population to convert to Islam. Anyways, the troops themselves often lived, especially in southern Iraq and in places like Fustat, which will be the future Cairo. It lived in what are called garrison cities, Amsar. We're going to get into that a bit more in a second, but just keep that in mind that they basically lived in often sequestered areas. Sometimes in Palestine and Syria, they lived in the cities or close by. Now, what actually was going on why didn't they meet any resistance? Now remember, this area here, that was under the Byzantines. This area here, this was Sasanians. But the Byzantines and Sasanians had just finished a very long and very devastating war against each other. There were different moments in which these two groups had been fighting, and therefore they could not mount an effective counter to the new unified nomadic troops, and nor, for example, were the Sasanians really expecting a threat from the south. The Byzantines more successfully tried to counter the new armies coming out, the new Muslim armies coming out, and there were some losses on the part of the Muslims, but they were eventually able to defeat the Byzantines, and a new border emerges essentially along this route here, kind of Antioch to Mosul to this area, basically keeping Asia Minor or Anatolia separate from this area. The other parts that were going to be attacked are over here. Tesif basically moving in initially to control the nomadic populations. The Sasanian kings organize an army to counter them, but they are completely routed, destroyed. I think here in Qadisiyah, the Sasanian Shah escapes. Doesn't make up quite, tries to organize for a year or two something against it, eventually is killed in battle, and that is the end of the Sasanian Empire. So actually very quickly the rise of the these Arab nomads who are now under the kind of Muslim/believer movement, they enter at precisely the right time. They find essentially a military and political vacuum that they're able to seize and take quickly control over this area in a time that probably 50 years earlier they wouldn't have been able to do. We're going to get more into in a second.